So typically, refreshing your Greek is nowhere near as much work as it was to do it the first time. And so it should be a much faster process. I get questions from time to time from people who say, look, it's been a while since I've done anything on my Greek. I really need to sort of go back a bit. How do I go about doing that? Well, this video is really about how do you reset your Greek. And then once you've got that reset done, then how do you get back into it and make sure that doesn't happen again? So if you've been learning Greek for a little bit and maybe you took a break for a while, life happens, things like this get in the way. Sometimes you just forget your Greek over the summer after a couple of semesters of seminary. This is just what happens. These things really do tend to trip us up. And so it's not uncommon for people to need to go back and just sort of refresh their Greek a little bit and maybe even recover it in some cases as well. And so it depends really, the question of whether you need to refresh or recover or whatever really depends on how long it's been and how much you've retained. And that's going to differ from one person to another. One person who's young is going to be able to remember a lot more probably than those of us who get a little bit older. Those of us who have only been out of it for a couple of weeks and are just feeling a little bit shaky with the last little bits we learned are going to be in a different boat to those who've been out of it for a couple of years. So there's a little bit of, difference here between one case and another, but I want to give you some principles here that should help anyway. The first thing is then with regards to the grammar, which is often the piece that people think, this is the piece I've really lost, is that grammatical element. And the key principle to bear in mind here is you want to go back to the last stage where you think you can have some confidence. So for instance, if you're working through, let's say, Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, and you got through to say chapter 20 or 21, thereabouts, where you were starting to work through second aorists and those sorts of things, and you're working with different roots and whatnot, and verb forms, and you're sort of a little bit hazy on all of that, well, I would encourage you to go back perhaps to chapter 13, chapter 14, how do your nouns work? How do you feel about those? Because you would have had time to bed those nouns in a little bit more, which should mean that they're a little bit more firm in your memory. And what I would encourage you to do here is to go back to those earlier chapters and just pick one that you feel might be doable, and then look at the chapter for it, read through the grammar, the chapter of the grammar that you're working through. And it doesn't really matter what grammar it is. I've just picked Mounce here just off the top of my head, but you can pick whatever. So go back to that chapter, look at the content of the chapter. How familiar are you with that chapter? And then if you're finding, yeah, okay, I do remember this, then what you want to do is get the exercises for that chapter and see if you can redo them. And if you can redo them, even if you're 70, 80% kind of thing, maybe you're not 100%, it's not really easy to do, well, that's probably actually okay. That's probably not far off where you were the first time you went through that chapter. And so that might be a really good starting point. And what you'll find is that you go back over the things you did learn after that, which you've forgotten, you'll find that those things will click into place a lot quicker this time because you're refreshing them, right? You've already learned them once, the hard work's been done, and hopefully it's not so long since you did it that it's going to be impossible to reinstate that memory as, in a reasonably time-efficient manner. So that would be the first thing with regards to grammar. Go back to where you were last confident, have a go there. If you find that you're not quite where you want to be there, well, go back another chapter or maybe two, but don't go too far back, and repeat that same process. Read through the content, try and do the exercises. If you can do the exercises, well, you're probably in a good position. If you go back and you find that that chapter is super easy, feel free to jump ahead a chapter and just find a place that's about that 70 to 80% rate where you can sort of, yeah, I think I've got this, but there's still some things I need to kind of refresh and learn, and you can go back and look those up and then continue to move forward. Now you might find that when you're going back and you're doing those translation exercises, you might find that your vocabulary is not where it needs to be as well. And the advice I'm going to give you here is going to differ from one app to another. Here's the principle you want to work on. Basically, you want to eliminate all the vocabulary you can down to where you can be reasonably reliable and you're not going to be overwhelmed with the sheer amount of vocabulary. If you've learnt 3,000 words in the Greek New Testament and you have not looked at any of them for 3-4 months, you're probably going to have somewhere around, depending on the app you're using and how it works, but for the most part, if you're using Flashcards Deluxe, which is what we use in Biblical Mastery Academy, you're going to probably find that you have somewhere around 700 to 1,000 words to review, which can be quite overwhelming. So in Flashcards Deluxe, there is a tool in there that you can actually say, push back due dates. And what I encourage you to do here is to use that click on that pushback due dates, and then set it to the number of days since you last reviewed your vocabulary. And this is the first thing to do. So rather than eliminate vocabulary, just reset it to where you were at that stage. That means then you're going to want to look at how many days roughly has it been since I last did that. Now, aim for on the low side here. So if it's been about 3 months, then make it about 2.5 months. Work out the number of days. Maybe you want 80, 90 days, somewhere in there. Put that number in, hit pushback due dates, and see what happens with it then. See how many words you've got. Now, if you can manage the number of words that it then provides you after you've done that, great. Carry on, get into it, and do it. If not, well, push it back a few more days at a time. Again, shrink that time because you don't want to push it back another 3 months because then it's like going back 6 months and you're not going to get any vocabulary for 3 more months or thereabouts. So the way this works is going to vary from one app to another, like I said, but this is a great way of just going back to where you were before you stopped doing vocabulary in a really simple and easy way. Now, if you can't push back due dates in that manner, and some apps may not give you that option, then essentially what you're going to need to do is eliminate the more recently learned words that you've taken on. So if you were going through, maybe you were using something like Bible Vocab Plus, and you had learned all the vocab that occurs 50 times or more in the New Testament, and maybe you're working through, I don't know, the Gospel of John or something like that, then what you want to do is probably eliminate at least the last few chapters of the Gospel of John that you learned the vocabulary for, and see if you can review and revise those ones that you learned reasonably well before you finish. Now, again, in this case, you're probably going to want to use some way of pushing back those due dates if you can, or maybe just work your way at, say, 100 words a day or something like that. But give yourself a limit and work on that basis, and that's at least going to help you move forward to some extent with those words. And of course, if you're not getting through them all with that, whatever time it is, then you might need to eliminate a few more words from your vocab that you're reviewing to be able to do that. Again, this is going to differ from one app to another, so just take a look at the app you're using. But if you are using Flashcards Deluxe, which I think is a great app, then the pushback due dates is going to make this super easy. You're just going to push the dates back to the last date you did the review, and then there you are. The next day is going to give you, there's the words that you would have done on the day you stopped doing them, and you can just do those and just carry on from there. Now, if you find those words hard to remember, well, that's okay, right? Mark them down and just move on, and it'll ask you to review them again, and you can do that. Once you've eliminated the vocabulary that you aren't so certain about, it should be reasonably easy to catch up on the vocabulary that you learned well a while ago, because it's probably still there in your long-term memory, just needs a little bit of a dust off. And then of course you should be able to go back to re-adding those words that you also learned. Again, that will be much faster than it was the first time you learned it as well. So typically refreshing your Greek is nowhere near as much work as it was to do it the first time. And so it should be a much faster process, but it does take some time and it does take a little discipline. Speaking of discipline, this is going to be the most challenging thing that's probably going to be to getting back into the flow of learning Greek again. Because often the reason we stopped learning Greek, or the thing that fell apart, was we stopped taking the time each day to do those things. And so it's going to be important to actually find a smidgen of time somewhere in the day, and you probably want to start with 15 to 20 minutes and see if you can add another 15 or 20 minutes somewhere else, and mix that up between reading/translating the text and also doing some vocabulary. And that would be what I would encourage you to do as well. Again, you'll need to put in place the disciplines to make that happen, but get into it and do it, and that's going to make sure you're successful in the future. Speaking of the future, now that you've got that process underway again, you're learning Greek and you're back into the habit of things again, what can you do to not get into the same position again? How can you keep going and making that strong, continuous, consistent progress that I keep talking about? Well, the first thing is you want to make sure that you're building a really strong foundation. This is going to mean that if you do have to go back, the foundation is going to be strong enough so you don't have to go back too far. So this is where really, during the beginning Greek phase in particular, you're going to want to go back and revise and review and remind yourself of things you've already learned. And in Biblical Mastery Academy, in our beginning Greek courses, we actually provide you with review worksheets for every lesson to go back over things you've already learned. And just by completing those review sheets, then you'll be in a really good, strong position to ensure that you can move forward with confidence without forgetting all the things that you've learned previously. So review is a critical step to making sure your foundation is strong, which will actually prevent you from forgetting. And even if you do stop for a bit, you won't forget anywhere near as much because there's that consistency that's been really helpful. The second thing I want to encourage you to do is don't go too fast. One of the things that we see people do is there's an impatience often with Greek, and so they'll try and whiz through. And particularly once you get through beginning Greek, people will learn the entire vocabulary of the Greek New Testament in maybe just 2 years, but they don't know their grammar. You want to make sure that you are working at a pace that is going to actually work. And bear in mind that the grammars that you're using, that the people who wrote those, the programs that you might be using, those have been written by people who know what they're doing. They've written it this way for a reason, and it's often based on their own experience teaching students. So if you're working through a Greek grammar, trust the grammar. Let the author do the work of drawing you through at a pace and asking you to do the exercises and review sheets, presumably, that they're going to ask you to do, so that you're able to keep and retain that Greek even well down the track. And don't go so fast that you don't do that review work and that you don't learn it well. You want to learn each step well. If you get to the end of a lesson and you're finding you're not quite grasping this, there are 2 things I normally encourage people to do. First of all, one thing that never hurts to do is to go grab another Greek grammar, look at the chapter that you're working through, the equivalent chapter, look at what they say about that chapter and read it. And then you get a different, just a fresh perspective on it. And often also, when you're doing that with the grammar, you can also use their exercises to give yourself a little bit of extra practice. The other thing to do when you are finishing a lesson and it's not quite gelling is to actually use something like a parsing app, a verb parsing app like Parse Greek or something like that, to go back over the principles of this chapter, because those principles are going to be critical for you in terms of helping you to remind yourself of how to put all these elements together. So Parse Greek or mastergreek.com or something like that are great tools just for learning and refreshing and revising even the section that you've just been learning and then solidifying that. And of course, you can always expand that backwards to refresh yourself with other things as well. And this is a really helpful tool for doing that. But at the end of the day, you're probably never going to feel like you 100% know the content of every chapter, and that's okay. Move on to the next chapter and just keep making progress. That's more important than getting that feeling that I know this cold, because really there's so much to learn and there's so many contexts in which you're going to have to work these things out that you're better off developing a broader understanding of how the language works by going on to the next step, which will then help gel the previous steps generally anyway. So just keep moving forward, even if you're not 100% sure you've got every concept in the Greek grammar nailed. In fact, normally this perfectionism is actually going to hold you back. So don't be a perfectionist. Keep moving forward. That's the most important thing. Thirdly, to keep your Greek, once you've refreshed it, make sure you keep maintaining those daily disciplines. It's better to do a little bit every day than to do nothing. So if you can't fit everything in a day, just do some vocab. Just do some parsing with Parse Greek or mastergreek.com or something like that. But just do a little bit every day, and that's going to do a much better job of keeping that Greek in your mind than if you don't do anything. So if you've got no time to do translations, if you don't have time to do Parse Greek, flick through some vocabulary. If you don't have time to read Greek, at least go translate one verse, something like that. Just pick one little thing, spend 2 to 5 minutes, and you'll find that this alone is going to help you maintain your Greek better than just doing nothing. So maintain those disciplines. It's going to help you be successful. If you're making some progress through Greek and you've found some tips that might be helpful for others, leave a comment in the comment section below. Let us know. I'd love to hear your tips down there as well. And if you are interested in learning or refreshing your Greek, then go to bma.to/roadmap and download our roadmap. Go download that, grab a copy of it, and we'd love to help you take small, consistent steps toward mastery. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.